Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for being here. Please get settled. There are some seats in the front row for people who are coming in. We do not bite, I promise. Silence your phones if you haven't done already, and please make yourself comfortable. So pleased to have you here this evening. I'm Danielle Bosan. I am the Vice President of Policy Programs and the Director of the Arts Program for the Aspen Institute. And that is an unusually long and multifaceted title, but the Aspen Institute is an unusual and multifaceted place. Since it was founded 75 years ago, it has had art at its very heart. I just made that up, but look at that. But it is not an arts organization, but it is truly an arts-infused organization. It was founded with artists sitting at the same table with philosophers, academics, corporate titans, scientists, all coming together in the wake of catastrophe on a worldwide scale to say, what can we do to make society better? And the arts program, which is about to celebrate its 20th year in existence, is a part of that culture. It has two different distinct modes of being. The arts program works within the Aspen Institute to infuse the arts into our policy programs and our leadership programs, because we strongly believe that art is an important part of any conversation. And then we also do some external programming, like the one that you're at tonight, which also is a perfect example of how the arts is honoring public policy and a tool for understanding and unpacking tough questions. Tonight we are here in partnership with Bacon, and we are very excited for this partnership. It's always good to have partnerships between nonprofits and, may I call, for-profit law firm art, because the quality of the audience improves. We have such an interesting audience here tonight. We have people who are lawyers, we have artists, we have people in the arts community, we have a producer here of documentaries, and that just makes for an incredibly rich conversation that I hope you will all enjoy. And now, if I can see here, okay, I just want to introduce one of our incredible partners from Bacon to come here tonight to the podium. Please welcome Tristan Duncan.
Well, I join Danielle in welcoming you all here tonight. We are very excited for this art diplomacy discussion. I'm co-chair of Bacon's art law program, but I also was co-chair of the Aspen Institute's Justice and Society program several years ago when Meryl Chertoff was heading it. And I think Meryl may be here tonight. There she is. And what I loved about Meryl's leadership and Elliot Gerson's leadership as the head of Aspen's programming is that they demonstrated to me how the Aspen Institute can bring together differing points of view for collaboration and constructive discussion of difficult issues. But in the end, we end up finding creative solutions that Meryl described as transformative for those of us here at home, but also on the world stage more broadly. So when the European Union passed this new restitution and repatriation law, which went into full effect this past summer, we in the Shook Art Law Group immediately thought of the Aspen Institute and said, the art program, and in particular the art diplomacy program that's headed up by Danielle Bosan, as well as Kaylee Bryant Greenwell, who are amazing in their leadership, was the perfect group to put together a world-class panel of speakers and discuss this new law really as a jumping-off point for exploring the legal, the ethical, and the public policy implications of repatriation and restitution issues. So fast forward to today, and here we are in this wonderful space with this great group, a sold-out group, ready to hear the Aspen Institute tradition of lively discussion, which will be conversational in style, but hopefully will encourage you to ask questions and join the conversation, because I think in this very audience, the next most creative idea for advancing art diplomacy will be demonstrated tonight. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark Vlasic, who is our moderator and will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
thank you very much to our incredible hosts at Aspen, to our sponsors, but for you guys, we wouldn't be here today. And particularly thank you for all of you guys, because you're the ones that went out on a very cold evening to be part of this enriching conversation. And so we're delighted to be here, delighted to see you all. In a moment, I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves and give us a bit of the journey they've had to get here today. But since I'm going to ask them that question, I thought I would answer that question myself. So I am here because, like many people in this room, when I was a kid, I loved history and the great civilizations and archaeology and Indiana Jones movies, and I just wanted to see like a little taste of that. So between university at Georgetown and law school at Georgetown, I took a year off to backpack around the world, and I wanted to see every major UNESCO site, which I saw a lot of them. During that trip around the world, I saw that so much of the world was looted and destroyed, and that really pained me because I had great expectations at seeing these amazing things. And in many places, I saw little posters saying the original resides in this museum or somewhere else. And that was also frustrating for me because I went to these other places to see these treasures, and turns out they're in some European capital. And so that struck me. After I finished law school, I worked briefly at a big law firm, but then spent 3 years at the UN War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague. And I spent 3 years doing investigations and prosecutions on genocide cases. In that chapter, I saw that one warring party in particular didn't just kill lots of people, they blew up their cultural heritage. They destroyed their cultural heritage. They wanted this community disappeared. And that really struck me, how intentional it was, because I was an Army ROTC cadet at Georgetown, and you learn quickly not to waste munitions. And in this case, this warring party was using munitions which were expensive to blow up culture. Later on, I wound up working for the president and the Secretary of Defense. And in that chapter, I traveled around the world a lot with the boss. And I was surprised how often kings, presidents, and prime ministers wanted us to see a museum or a cultural site. I'm like, culture is important to our bilateral relationships, but even our military relationships. And so later on, when I went to work for the president of the World Bank, I worked on this thing called the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, learned more about illicit trafficking, and had a better understanding of why some of these things were stolen, why these things were put into the kind of illicit marketplace, if you will. And then when I finished that job and left to teach at Georgetown and have my own law firm, I started getting involved in an effort to recover the stolen treasures. And I was very much working with countries that had things stolen from it. And I had a bit of a purist view at that time. And that's evolved, as we will talk about today. But that work, and particularly working with Homeland Security investigations, the Italian Carabinieri, led to a TV series called Blood and Treasure. So I'll give it a plug. Think Indiana Jones meets James Bond. And the hope of the show was to try to do what the movie Blood Diamonds did for Complex Diamonds, but for complex antiquities, to educate a broader audience, not that anyone here needs education because you're here, but to say there's a linkage between looted antiquities, transnational crime, and terrorism, and to really engage on this. And so that is the reason that I care deeply about this subject. I care deeply about our experts here tonight, and they each have their own stories as to how they got into this work. And so maybe hear a bit about your stories, and then we'll start a conversation. Hannah.
That's it. Well, thank you so much. You are quite an act to follow. I came to this almost from the flip side of the coin, if you will. I am the daughter of 2 university professors and grew up in a house filled with art and music and shelves upon shelves of books, and spent a year when I was 12 years old in Cambridge, England, when my parents were on sabbatical there. And during that time, we traveled extensively around Europe and went to many of the world's great encyclopedic museums, the Louvre, British Museum, the Hermitage. And so my early exposure in the late 1980s, which is important to note here because it's an evolving discussion of this issue, was, wow, this is amazing art and cultural objects, and I want to learn more. So I went off to college and became an art history and French undergrad. That led me to New York for a few years, and then on to London, where I was at the Sotheby's Institute studying art business. And then I learned about art and cultural heritage law and thought, oh, I need to go back to school for further education and become an art lawyer because these issues are just too interesting, which is just what I did. Actually ended at Georgetown.
And I then proceeded to work at DOJ for about 7 or 8 years as an appellate litigator. During that time, I did a detail to Interpol's Cultural Property Crimes Program, which gave an interesting perspective on some of these issues. And I began teaching, which is also really a helpful place to learn about different perspectives, how the narrative is changing. And then I moved from DOJ to become the Army's first attorney for its large system of museums across the United States, Europe, and Asia. There are 47 of them. And there were some 600,000 objects ranging from Norman Rockwell paintings to German Nazi war art to all manner of cultural objects representing the Army's history. And at the time, there was no centralized oversight. There was a 20-plus year regulation. There was no collections management plan in place. And so I learned a lot about what it is to be a museum counsel engaging in many of the issues I imagine arose in this enterprise. And from there, I had the privilege of joining Shikardi with Tristan and Alicia. And what's great about that is that I bring the museum perspective, but I'm able to apply it to a much broader range of issues engaging as a private practitioner.
Thank you. I'm glad I didn't follow you. Right.
Thank you. So I am Ruti Spadola, the owner and founding director of Gallery Ruti, which is a contemporary fine art gallery and art advisory, celebrating our 20th year in existence this year, having been in the arts industry for over 30 years. By invitation of the U.S. Department of State, I was invited to serve as a member of the U.S. delegation to Dakar, Senegal, in 2024 as part of the Biennale, Dakar Biennale. And that invitation was an extension and a reflection of the relationship that I've had with the State Department for over 15 years. Through my gallery, we have loan works for display through the Arts and Embassies program, and we have also sold works through that very program. And I'm proud to say that at one point I represented Amy Sherrill, and I was able to visit the piece that the State Department acquired from me years ago, which is on display in its embassy in Dakar. So my focus and expertise is in the work of African and African-American artists. And as a consultant, I've worked on several projects with now closed, but very important while it existed, and that was Trans-Africa and Africare. Both of those organizations at the time did extensive work and helping different African countries with infrastructure development, educational programming. And as a result of that, many objects from those various countries that they worked with were either gifted, and sometimes the possession was questionable, contested, which I discovered while working with Dr. Oforiansa, who's no longer with us, but he was an expert and professor at Howard University. So Dr. Ansa was a mentor and a scholar and someone whose knowledge is deeply missed. But what I learned, the importance of what I learned while working with Dr. Ansa was that the historiography of African art, which he instilled in me, is our cultural capital. Those objects were really the utilitarian and ceremonial objects of people who it was lost by way of colonialism. In many cases, it was under the systems of violence, coercion, and an extreme imbalance of power. And that also is a reflection of how many works have been placed or found their way into Western collection. So I come this evening with 30 years of experience in the field, but also a student because I'm interested in learning more about this law, who authored it,
whose interest it protects and whose voices have been marginalized through this process.
Chase?
So I will eschew chronology and try to be as brief as I possibly can. I think I'm sitting here wearing 3 hats. I'd propose that. The first hat is personal. I grew up in a house which, as I like to put it affectionately and respectably, was filled with third-rate chinoiserie. My father was born in China. My grandparents lived in China for 20 years. And what that childhood inculcated in me was a deep, deep respect for culture. What I did not understand at the time was that I was surrounded by loot in some sense. Mind you, my grandparents did not exercise very good taste in but it was loot all the same. One hat. Second hat is my area of expertise. I'm a trained historian, and my area of expertise is early Islamic history, the 7th, 8th, and 9th century. And all of the work that a trained historian does in that part of the world, indeed in other parts of the world, is predicated on the survival of cultural heritage, of texts, of documents, of artifacts, all of which have been preserved, curated, in the case of text, edited. At the same time, I was working originally, the subject of my first book, on a period and a culture which had been obliterated. Well, they was. In fact, my original research was on the city of Mosul, which has now experienced multiple obliteration. So the personal, the professional, but I'm here really, I suspect, in large measure because of the work that the museum that I have the privilege of looking after, the National Museum of Asian Art at the Smithsonian, has been doing in the way of advancing our own understanding of cultural heritage, especially our legal and our ethical obligation. We've worked really hard, not just to discharge those legal and ethical responsibilities, but also to provide some leadership to a museum field which, how shall I put it, has been phlegmatic in some respect, but is changing. So I thank my host, I thank the sponsors, and I look forward to it.
And I thank everyone for going after me because this is an incredible panel we have here today. And what really brings us together is this new law change that we've seen across the water. And so, Hannah, I'd love for you to give us a primer on this, on what's happened, why are we all here, and why is this something that we should be thinking more deeply about?
Well, sure. And trying to appreciate that not everyone in this room is a lawyer, and I can rapidly put you to sleep with a dry recitation of the law, but I'll just try to boil down what it is that is our jumping off point. It's an EU regulation that went into full effect in July of last year, and it's aimed at combating the illicit trafficking of cultural objects. But already, critics are concerned that its effect will be to restrict the illicit market for cultural objects moving into EU countries because of requirements for documentation that was never issued in the first place or has been lost over the passage of time. The law applies to mainly antiquities that are either over 200 years old or 250 years old, depending on how they're classified under the law. And it requires that importers of these objects into any EU country must now show documentation that the objects were lawfully exported from their country of origin. Or, if that can't be established, or the object was removed earlier than 1972, then the country in which they've been held continuously for 5 years. There are a lot of challenges that this law presents. As I mentioned before, provenance records are incomplete. They may have degraded. They may not exist for objects that were removed decades ago from countries that didn't have strong export regimes. Importers bear full liability and possible criminal penalty. So even if the information seems good, it might be too great a risk. And And even if an importer has valid paperwork, the object may still be seized if the country of origin challenges the initial export. And then finally, classification of objects is somewhat unclear, which can lead to greater confusion about what exact requirements exist for any given object. There is an important exception for museums that are receiving objects on loan, but still, and it's too early to tell, the concern is that this may reduce the ability to send objects into EU countries, either for sale or in loan status to non-museum actors.
It was incredibly helpful. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how leaders are navigating the ethical and diplomatic considerations of this current situation.
So, not to completely kick the can, but it is early days, and I think what I would say to that, and I think why this law there's something else they said so in so many of the stakeholders in this overall dialogue. So we're looking at museums, collectors, galleries, different governments, and other aspects. Each of these stakeholders may value cultural objects differently. The aesthetic value, the cultural heritage significance, their ability to educate, to build diversity through cultural connections, scientific analysis, monetary value. And how do we align these divergent, sometimes, values? And I think what we'll be talking about on this panel is just that. And who are the stakeholders, but also who is pushing this dialogue, whether it's from law or policy, or who's actually listening to the ethical considerations. And so I'm really pleased to be on this panel because I think that discussions just like this are part of what drives the international dialogue, and not leave it there.
That's incredibly helpful. I'm friends with a guy named Prince Ermias from Ethiopia, who I'm guessing you know, who spent a lot of time trying to recover the heritage that was looted from Ethiopia from other folks. And it's been interesting to see the angst that a community has for things that, for me, that has a very short history. My family came as refugees in the 50s, of something that is deeply touching to an entire community. And so I'd love to turn to you, Matisse. How do we critically assess the ethics of these laws today? It's easy for a lawyer to come up with, like, this is our way of looking at this. You have a much deeper sense of what has happened. Who's writing these laws? Whose values do they encode? And whose voices remained absent from these conversations?
Yes, I mean, those are the concerns that I have. I don't know that I have all of the answers, but I operate in an industry that is unregulated. And so I'm always looking to others for ethical leadership. And the arts industry is, driven by one's moral codes, and some people have morals and others do not. They're unscrupulous. So if we put the legal compliance aside and really consider and examine the ethical responsibilities tied to cultural heritage, what does that mean? Who governs that, and who will enforce it? And so, I have a lot of friends from the continent of Africa. And one of the challenges that they face is like the British Museum, which, has thousands of objects. And I was shocked to see how much looting, pillage is represented in the museum of the cathedral in Rome. I mean, my husband and I were walking through, and I thought it became uncomfortable because I thought, and there's a large fee associated with entrance to both of these museums. And so what of the source communities, what if they can't afford to pay to view those objects? What did those objects mean to them historically, ritual and traditions? And is or are any of those objects being considered for repatriation? And if so, who determines that? So it's about, maybe reimagining what repatriation is and may be, and in doing so, consider what stewardship now looks like, what shared authority looks like, and what cultural exchange really means. And in exchange, I mean one that is equitable. So that's kind of my position on it.
Can you dive in a little more deeply on stewardship and what you see and how that brings people together possibly?
Well, stewardship means perhaps that the object is on loan, but the source community dictates what those terms are. And just jokingly, during one of our preliminary discussion, I thought, well, we have all of this technology now, that being 3D modeling, and if that is not an option, perhaps the museum could commission an artist, that ethnic group, to replicate the piece, and then the original work object goes back to that source community, and the replicated piece of a contemporary artist becomes part of the museum's collection. So that's what I mean by stewardship, this reimagine what those relationships possibly be.
And this is what I think is one of the most interesting areas of this topic, where early in my life in doing this, it was a quick, let's figure out how to get this stuff back. And as I've spent more time working on this, turns out these matters are often very complex. There's lots of different stakeholders engaged, and trying to figure out the best, frankly, negotiation between different parties to figure out how do people each feel like they're finding a solution that they can accept and manage based upon the unique histories of these objects. And I think it's great that we have someone representing a museum I'd add that is free for all of us. So I'd love to hear how your museum is engaged in cultural diplomacy.
So how much time do you
have? We have 30 minutes.
So your question is a broad one. How are we engaged in cultural diplomacy? And we do a great deal, some of it more conventional, at least in some respects than in others. In that category, the relatively conventional, I would put major loan shows, in which we have the privilege of sharing extraordinary pieces of cultural heritage, which otherwise would be inaccessible to audiences here. Quick example, which actually is one that embeds another example. We have a loan show up right now, which is terrific. I urge you all to attend. It's up for 2 more weeks. It's called Korean Treasures. It's extraordinary national treasures from Korea. It's been a fabulous privilege. One of the interesting stories of how this collection was put together comes from a collection assembled starting in the 60s, 70s, and 80s by a former chairman of Samsung, was how deliberate Lee Gon-hee was in acquiring Korean works that had moved to Japan and reconstituting the cultural heritage of Korea. It's an interesting example. We tend to think about colonialism in its prevailing form of Western, but in fact, there are multi-directionality to colonialism. And that's one example of what you'll see in that show. In, shall we say, less conventional areas of cultural diplomacy, we are, of course, a trust instrumentality. You'll understand in these circumstances, I'm keen to make clear we're not part of the United States government. But we work very closely with our colleagues in the State Department, and we work very closely because we have enormous respect for what they do, and they have enormous respect for the complementary role we can play. And that has taken us in all sorts of interesting, and I'd like to think productive ways. 2 examples, if I may.
Please.
If you come to the museum, you'll find a small exhibition on artifacts from Yemen. It's a bit of a Janus-faced exhibition. Half of the exhibition is given over to a collection of hours of material from South Arabia, which reveals the extraordinary culture of early first millennium South Arabia. We now associate Yemen with cultural destruction and violence and poverty. That wasn't the case in the beginning of the Common Era. The second half of the show displays pieces which were never part of our collection, which were interdicted and seized by the U.S. government and legally repatriated to Yemen. That is to say, in an arrangement that the United States government made with the internationally recognized government of Yemen, which was of the view that their physical return would have imperiled them, as it manifestly would. So you'll come to see, if you come to the galleries, funerary stelae, leaves from the Quran, other objects. Funerary stelae, for instance, of small blotches of blue paint. Our best guess is that was the work of the looters claiming those pieces, wanting to be paid for the work they'd done looting the pieces. So the second half of the exhibition tells a story not of first millennium Yemen, but of late 20th and early 21st century Yemen, the destruction of cultural heritage, dissolution of order, and the entrance of its cultural heritage into an international market. That's one example. There's another example which probably I should hold off on. It's a little bit more complicated, but a really important set of returns that we've made to Cambodia, and a whole set of arrangements, understandings, projects, and collaborations that are the direct result of the proactive work that we did, not waiting for legal claims, but undertaking the research in advance. I'm very proud of the fact that our museum, there's no museum in the world that has a larger provenance department, is more active in doing provenance and object history, and more transparent. If you come, almost 3 examples from Sarah, I'm on number 5. If you come to our South Asian galleries, you will see didactics that say, we have concerns about this piece. There's ongoing research about this piece. We really try, how should I put it, to show our work. And in that respect, show respect to those objects, show respect to the cultures that produce them.
And I think that collaboration you had and you have with Yemen is a unique example of working with governments. And to show my bias, I've, on a pro bono basis, helped support a handful of law enforcement agencies, and I worked on that case. I also worked on a related case in that it was looted antiquities, but from these were seized up in New York, and they were from Afghanistan. And in that case, they were delivered to the Afghan officials. They wound up coming down here to DC. The Afghan ambassador hosted an exhibit that lasted about a day and a half, and then they were all packed up and sent back to Afghanistan. Obviously, I have no idea what happened to those antiquities, and I think this is another aspect of these recoveries where, you know, your tax dollars help support law enforcement that spend a tremendous amount of time tracking these things down, figuring out how to, you know, what the provenance is, seizing it, returning it to the rightful owners, which is incredibly just and I think incredibly important, and it's very important work. But then you look at the difference between a Yemen case where all of us can go see this stuff and Afghanistan where, you know, hopefully it's in a crate somewhere in a basement, it's still safe, right? And I think it demonstrates the complexity of all these cases and the hard work for all the practitioners, whether it be lawyers or people who have galleries or people who have museums, on how you engage with different constituencies for this. Hannah, I'd love to hear a few examples. We started the example process, and of course, for the lawyers, we love the cases because it takes the law and makes it real. Could you give us some examples of cases you've worked on to highlight these issues?
Yeah, sure. So the main case that I worked on for the Army was the bells of Balanghiga. These were church bells that were taken by U.S. soldiers from the Philippines in the early 1900s during the Philippine-American War. And the bells had been used, well, actually, I need to give you the historical context. So the United States had acquired the Philippines at the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898. And immediately thereafter, the Filipino nationalists began fighting for their independence. And the insurgents used these Catholic church bells in the village of Balanghiga to signal the Balanghiga massacre, which was a bloody attack on U.S. soldiers occupying the town. 45 soldiers were killed. And the United States Army responded in kind, the brutal retaliation. Right out of the gate, we have kind of a difficult chapter in the Philippine national history and the U.S. history. The bells had become a potent symbol of Filipino nationalism and a historical symbol of their colonialist history. For the United States, it was more complicated. It was a chapter of their military history. But at the same time, there were the families of the victims who had fought in the Philippines, and their a symbol of their sacrifice and valor in service of their country. And there was an active veterans group who felt very strongly that the bells should remain in the United States and had already lobbied Congress to enact legislation to do that. Flash forward, and the Philippine government requested the return of the bells. And at the time, I was the attorney who was tapped to write the memo to the Secretary of Defense, and rolled up my sleeves and dug in. And we saw many of the same issues that we're talking about here today. The historical record was incomplete. So right away, it was hard to determine whether or not the bells had been taken legally. There were many different explanations. Maybe they were taken as war trophies. Maybe they had been taken to be melted down as scrap metal. Maybe, and one very implausible account was they had been gifted by the village. And potentially they were taken for military necessity so that they couldn't be used again to signal another attack. But putting aside whether or not there was a legal justification, we were in good company with the Smithsonian and with other institutions and actors to start delving into what are the other considerations that inform who is the proper steward for these objects. Does the value placed on the military history for the United States outweigh the national heritage component for the Philippines? And what's more, could the return of the bells serve as cultural diplomacy, an important act of friendship, closing a chapter on a painful part of our history? And ultimately, the decision was that they should go back. Then it became the complicated question of, well, who gets them when they go back? Because these were Catholic church bells. And ultimately, the decision was made that they would go to the Philippines, but be reinstalled at the church in Antigua that had been reconstructed. And then as a final point, we were looking to satisfy all parties. And so it ended up that we had 3D copies of the bells made and reinstalled at the Army base in the United States so that a memorial site remains here in the United States for the veterans group.
The touching story for me, I'm in the Army and happen to be Catholic. And a year ago, I actually helped lead a Georgetown delegation to Japan with Father Mark Bosco, who's the head Jesuit priest at Georgetown. He's the vice president for mission ministry. And the reason we went is because a friend of mine who is a Zen Buddhist priest in Kyoto has his own temple, which he inherited from his father, which he inherited from his grandfather. And at that temple is the oldest Jesuit and Christian bell likely in Japan. And the reason it's there is because in the Second World War, the Imperial Army set up a notice that anything of steel or metal, they were going to go come seize. And folks realized that this ancient bell would likely be seized and would likely be melted down and turned into bullets. And so folks told the priest, the Zen Buddhist priest, my friend's grandfather at the time, he accepted the bell, he put it in a big sake container, and he buried it in the backyard and basically put a rock garden over it. And then when the Imperial Army came, he offered up his bell for that to be taken and melted down. And at the end of the war, they dug up the bell and they were presented to the community. And the community said, honestly, like, you saved the bell, keep it here as a testament to our relationship. And that, for me, was a beautiful story that I heard years ago. And this year we just finished is the 440th anniversary of the relationship between Japan and the Holy See and the Vatican. And what better time to celebrate this? And there's a new cardinal, the first Japanese cardinal, forever, who's now in Japan. And we told him that story. And for him and the American ambassador that happens to be Catholic, this is a beautiful story of communities coming together and trying to find a way to celebrate our communal cultural heritage. And what Pope Francis would say is our human family. And I think these are the stories that help connect people. And I'd love to hear, you've now had this chapter in government, now you're now in the private sector. How do you talk to your clients about this? And what are examples your clients are looking at how they manage these new situations?
Yeah, so being in the private sector obviously broadens the scope tremendously. And it brings in many of the threads that we've been talking about already. Some of the examples that I've looked to have been the kind of collaborative repatriation solutions or repatriation partnerships that have arisen over the last year or so. Two that spring to mind are that the Worcester Museum in Massachusetts proactively began conducting provenance research into its collection items. And this is emblematic of a real shift in the ethics and the policies of museums. And they became persuaded that several objects had been looted from Italy. They approached the Italian Ministry of Culture, and the objects were repatriated. But it didn't end there. They entered into an agreement whereby the objects could remain repatriated in place for a number of years. And then when they are ultimately returned to Italy, they'll receive a rotating loan of objects for a period of time. And then those objects will go back and be replaced by additional objects. And so it allows for the type of creative solution that you were mentioning before of how can we continue to enjoy access to these cultural objects around the world while also being mindful of their origins, of the nature of their taking, of the historical record. And then in a completely different context, the context of Nazi stolen art, there are a number of different examples, but the one I think I'll talk about is at the Kunstmuseum in Basel. And the heirs of the original collector, Kurt Glaser, he sold his impressive collection of artwork in 1933, under duress in order to flee Nazi Germany. And the museum agreed, rather than to return the objects to the heirs, to publish a book writing about Kurt Glaser, about his collection, and also acknowledging the manner in which that collection was divested. And so it's an interesting resolution of a case where it wasn't necessarily driven solely by monetary compensation or property ownership. It's looking, again, at these issues of the historical record.
Thank you. Patrice, as the legal frameworks around restitution evolve, enforcement often remains uneven and dependent on political will and institutional self-regulation. Who ultimately holds responsibility and accountability for this? Is it museums, the practitioners, the marketplace? Who do we look for guidance on these issues?
Well, I think that all of the sectors have a responsibility in making certain that where the source community would like to have the object returned, that is in fact what occurs. This returning objects, while it sounds noble, can be very difficult and problematic, especially when it comes, we're dealing with continent of Africa, where, there's a history of a structural inequity. And we say, geez, we want this returned. Then who do we return it to? Is there an institution? Must it be placed in the hands of an institution, which for many African countries, there isn't a museum that can house the piece? Or is it returned to the source communities? So, we're not complacent in this. I think as a gallerist who has been in a position, in addition to working on projects, I deal with secondary market work and a lot of folks who have served in the Peace Corps. That's how the National Museum was established, the Museum of African Art, because of, oh my God, what is his name? Robinson, Warren Robinson, and he was a Peace Corps worker and brought back this, a huge collection of cultural objects, and that was how the museum's collection began, and the museum was built around that. And some of those works, we've had conversations in closed rooms about those being contested and wondering what Mr. Robinson did and how he acquired them. But needless to say, I mean, the history of those objects and how they came to be, whether it be in Europe or in the U.S., we still need to listen to what the source community wants, I think, and have a sense of be ethically responsible for if it be that they want them returned. I know that the manuscripts from Ethiopia, that was a big project and I think that had more success than many others, like the Benin.
Do you want to give us some more detail?
No, I don't.
Doesn't matter. Maybe for some folks, if you would give it.
I don't have in-depth knowledge, and I was not involved. And a friend of mine, who I had hoped to be here tonight, she was intimately involved in both of those projects, the Benin and the return of the manuscripts. The manuscripts were in Howard University's collection, and she worked on the project along with State Department and many other organizations to make certain that those manuscripts were returned and received and placed in the hands as was requested. The Benin effort became a little problematic because, we have to study and understand the history of those cultural objects. And the Benin are the people and not an institution. So returning them to the people and surprise of the museum that had them, we just have to understand the nuances of this effort and doing justice by whomever, again, that object was taken from and the circumstances. And again, going back to the history of that and being sensitive to the needs of those communities and those being the source communities. So it's with the laws, we have compliance. There still is equally important for me, given my experience, about the ethical responsibilities that we have. I worked on a project with the National Museum of Niger, which was an amazing and fascinating opportunity, and that was led by my sister. My niece is here, but it was to research and document the utilitarian and ceremonial objects created by the 8 nomadic groups of women in the country, and that culminated into an exhibition at the museum. And what I learned through that experience was pride of the people who were there, autonomy over their production, and their willingness to loan it to any institution around the world that wanted to take it on and to travel it. But knowing that those objects were coming back to them and they had the say over that was very important to that entire process and their willingness to be a part of it. So, we spent time out in the desert with, the Tuaregs and the Tubus and the Hausas and others groups, and we learned how, the pottery was made and how the handwork was done. And this is a way in which, again, we talk about art and diplomacy. That is a beautiful example of a way in which we can be enriched by the cultures of others, but allowing them to have command over the process.
Beautiful. Thank you. Chase, we move to you. What role can the Smithsonian play in fighting illicit trafficking?
May I rephrase your question?
Please.
What role is the Smithsonian play? To pick up on a point that's been made with due deference to the lawyers in the room, sometimes the law is insufficient, right? And sometimes the law can be complicit in enforcing structural inequalities. I think it was for a number of reasons, not least of which was that sense that the law was inadequate or insufficient, that the Smithsonian in 2022 issued what is called a shared stewardship and ethical returns policy. And that is a policy which empowered, didn't force, it empowered the units of the Smithsonian to, at their discretion, with a measure of oversight, to respond to claims, but in our case, to open up opportunities for research and collaboration, which even in the absence of claims, allowed us to do justice that we felt needed to be done. So a specific example, which is about a month old in terms of public awareness, the return that we effected for of 3 objects to Cambodia, all Khmer objects. These are objects which we began to research several years ago. And I should say that provenance research, for reasons that have already come up, the difficulty, spottiness of documentation, ambiguity of transaction, the really difficult archival work that is often required is very slow. I've been asked by more than one reporter, why did your team take so long to do this research? I think seeking, to be honest, to put us on the defense. We were dragging our feet. No, that wasn't the case. We were working as hard as we could, working collaboratively with a network of scholars in Europe as well as in Cambodia. The issuing of the shared stewardship ethical return policy in 22 has enabled us in 25 to restitute Cambodia for objects which left during the 60s and 70s when violence and the dissolution of political order and security had opened up on an almost industrial scale the looting of Cambodian temples. And by industrial scale, I mean teams of spotters, helicopters, moving objects into Thailand where they were secreted temporarily and then entered into the market that was being driven mainly by appetites in Europe, North America. Example after example after example of dealers who were then not just highly reputed, but in fact had published catalogs, had worked closely with museums in establishing the canon of Khmer cultural heritage. Not all, not most, but many were directly or indirectly implicated in this industrial strength movement. The documentation was inconclusive. We had no doubt that they had left in circumstances which we would never entertain an acquisition now. So, in terms of museum practice, we work really hard in 2 areas. Point of acquisition, we now have standards which, and I say this mindful that in 20 years, my successor will say, their standards are too loose. We work to standards, I'm trying to answer your question, trust me, which are, believe me, much higher than the great majority of collecting museums. Within, I won't exaggerate, 90 minutes of the news breaking of those Cambodian returns, I got a phone call from a donor to our museum. What are you doing? Don't you know that Museum X, Y, and Z have the exact same materials and they're not sending them back? What's wrong with you? We work really hard in the case of those Cambodian pieces as an example of retrospective research, but we work really hard at the point of acquisition to ensure that I'm not embarrassed in 5 or 10 or 15 years. But they're judgment calls, object by object, and it costs us, not every day, not every week, but every month, it costs us pieces that would come to our museum, and we say no. But we do that because we're trying in our own modest way, not only to discharge our legal or ethical obligations, but we're a part of the market. And if we can communicate to other museums and collectors that if you want to put your piece on display, the National Museum of Asian Art, it has to adhere to the highest standard. We want to send that message.
Sorry, I think that's tremendous work. And my first case I worked on was a bunch of Khmer pieces in New York at a very fancy museum. And that case was one where I think the engagement of members of the board in allowing them to better understand that this is not a good situation. And in the process, in one particular case, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and I got a call from a wonderful human. He said, "Mark, I saw this piece in the New York Times. Really, I had to ask, did the New York Times commission the piece?" And I said, "No, I just pitched it." I said, "Well, it's even more lovely that they would, take a piece like this. Did you know my wife's on the board of this museum?" And I said, I did not know that. And I said, we're getting some interesting questions on the cocktail circuit, the dinner circuit. And I think this has shown how much things have changed in this kind of short arc where I've just been involved in both the kind of pro bono side, trying to get stuff back, and then working with clients and museums and collectors on trying to find this balance. But I think this moral compass that we're talking about is becoming much more entrenched in this conversation. I know we are swiftly finishing our hour, and I'm meant to be pivoting to questions to the audience. So I will look that we already have questions. I did want to ask an Int'l question, but I'll get to that later. But you're right up front, so let's hear a question. And do we have microphones by chance? If not, give me 1 second as the microphone comes up. I have a quick question, since we still have 2 minutes in my time. On Int'l, since you said you worked there. Int'l, I think, is this incredible institution, which I highlight in my TV series, by the way. But it has a lot of aura to it. But the question is, what is it doing when it comes to looted antiquities? And what was your work? And what do you think the future of Int'l is on this topic? And then we'll move to your question once you have a microphone.
Another question I could answer in like the next 45 minutes. I'll do my best for 2 minutes. It is an international law enforcement organization. It's bringing together police from around the world to share information and collaborate on crime. And I was embedded in so each country that is signed on to Interpol has a National Central Bureau. I was in DC in their cultural property crimes program, and they are focused on looted objects. And so it's not only sharing information around the world when an object goes missing, but it's also training customs officials to spot looted objects. You would be amazed at the creativity that smugglers come up with. One of the famous cases involves an ancient Egyptian head that the collector dipped in plastic and then painted to look like a cheap tourist object. So helping to spot exactly that. But then also this kind of whole of government approach, reaching across the State Department, HSI, and talking about the law and policy that is governing these matters in the United States, particularly the Cultural Property Advisory Committee that's looking at what import regulations to put in place to stem looted objects coming into the United States. I'll leave it there.
That's perfect. Thank you. Do you have a mic? Okay, sorry.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm Donna. I would like to address cultural diplomacy from the point of view of an independent artist, which I am. I'm new to DC, and one of the reasons I came is the attraction of the museums and the galleries, so I'll address the non-lawyers with this. So, artists get inspired by so many things. I'm inspired by so many things. This is a Hope diamond necklace I made inspired by the Gems of Mineral collection. I have made pieces inspired by the African Art Museum using real Ghana trade beads. I've been inspired by the Asian Museum making bracelets which actually are on peer with what's in your gift shop. So, I was struck by the comment that a non-ethnic of the country of provenance cannot make a replica, but cultural diplomacy is that, all other ethnicities, all cultures are inspired by that, and if the talents are there, should be able to be welcome to do that. And I feel sometimes that's labeled appropriation, which I feel is cutting off cultural diplomacy. Thank you.
Let's hold that question and go to the question in the back, and then we'll take 2 questions and we'll throw it to the panel here.
Good evening. So my name is Antonio, and thank you to the Aspen Institute for organizing this forum. It's rare to see this level of cross-disciplinary expertise in one room. I have a few questions, but I think
y'all one today.
But it does touch everything all of you have done thus far. So do any of you collect art? I think that's just one simple question. I think the others are more related to the EU regulation. How does the current EU regulation govern cultural property and illicit trade apply to historical contested works such as the Parthenon objects held by the British Museum? Given that the UK is no longer part of the EU, how, if at all, would those frameworks still influence claims involving objects removed during the colonial period? I do want to address back the question you were talking about objects.
Let's hold that question for a moment, and we have more time. We'll circle back, but we're all sticking around afterwards, so you can hit us up afterwards. But so these 2 questions, any volunteers?
Well, I think I'll attempt to answer that. That was what I shared was a Mertis idea, and in my offering of ideas for stewardship and ways in which authentic work taken under, again, violence or coercion or imbalance of power could be returned to the source communities. And just offering with my understanding, I'll make this very personal response here, of authenticity being important to most institutions, the source by which the piece was created, that was a way in which there might be some level of compromise and agreement if a piece were returned and they were seeking to have it created in a way that resembles and represents those indigenous folks. So it's not to say that they may not be able to come to you with your great talent. Your necklace is very beautiful, and seek you to create something that's lovely that could possibly sit in the platoon terrain and be marveled at. But, when the ceremonial and utilitarian objects are made, they become part of a community that serves it. It doesn't sit on a shelf. We bring those objects here, we put them on a shelf, and we put them in a glass case so that we can marvel them. But in those communities, they serve a far greater purpose, and they have far greater meaning. And so we put them in cases so that we can study them, and that scholarship is so important because it informs everything that I do. I seek scholarship in my writings and understanding of art and the world, but I understand the importance, the greater importance that those objects have, those cultural objects have, when they're held in the hands of the communities that created them. Yes.
We had a question on the UK and Greece.
Sure, I think that actually dovetails really nicely with your question, because I'll go back to my law school education, where the kind of founding father of cultural property law was John Henry Merriman, who talks about this cultural magic that lives in objects, that it's the original that really matters, and no copy or facsimile can ever hold that sort of magic. And wherever one falls out on that, I think that goes to the heart of the marbles. And the British Museum and many constituents there, I think, are of the view that those marbles have value in the UK. And of course, Greece feels strongly otherwise. And it's a case that is allowing for a lot of dialogue and potentially a really interesting and collaborative solution of the type that we've been discussing today. We'll see what happens. Stay tuned. I'm interested. But in terms of whether or not the new EU law could move the needle, not the new regulation. No, that's only relating to import of objects into EU countries, and the marbles are already in the UK. And at this point, a repatriation of the marbles would fall outside of that.
Yeah, follow up.
Well, again, I'm not a lawyer, but there are many ways in which, shall we say, traditional museums have defended their continuing ownership of pieces. In that particular case, it's an act of parliament prevents return, which to this non-lawyer is not a compelling argument, because an act of parliament could be another act of parliament, couldn't there? I think there are many really interesting aspects of the landscape upon which sit museums, galleries, private collectors, auction houses. And many of you will be aware of the opening, much delayed, of the Grand Egyptian Museum, all over the news. I recommend you reread some of the coverage in the light of these debates. And what you find is a very clear, deliberate strategy, communication strategy on the part of the Egyptian government, which boils down to the following assertion. For a century and a half, you've been telling us that we can't look after our antiquities. We now can, thank you very much. And many of you will travel. What you find in many parts of the world from which these objects were removed is an infrastructure of museums that is superior in some respects to the infrastructure of the museums holding those objects. We're aware of events in London which a museum in London had to employ someone to track down the objects that had been sold by a curator. We're aware of events in Paris. So at the very time in which countries of origin are increasing significantly and effectively their infrastructure, shall we say, the questions can be raised about the robustness of security. And it's just one aspect of the changing landscape, which I think is changing from 1 month to the next.
Okay, we're going to take the 3 questions I just saw. So
Has your hand up first.
all right, we're going to take them all together and then provide last words. So we'll go with you, you two, and then the back over here.
Hi, my name is Ngozi. Thank you all for being here today. This has been wonderful. So I have a question about this idea of repatriation and the recovery of lost objects specifically. So I'm Nigerian, and today is actually the anniversary of the end of the Biafran Civil War. So thank you. So one thing that I'm really curious about is, where do you begin on this process of recovery when you have no idea what's been lost, right? And I think for me, it's really interesting because I have my parents who still remember the Civil War, and they still remember some of the memories of, being moved from area to area, rebuilding their lives, safety, all of these terrible memories, right? But once again, that question persists. How do you begin to recover things, a newer generation, when you're not sure what's been lost, but still having that attachment to an older generation that has a memory? Is there a role that we can play, even if we're not involved in arts institutions in the same ways as you are, where we can collect some of those memories and maybe objects without being directly involved in that institution capacity?
Thank you. Woman with the scarf and the hat. You right here. Right.
I'm an artist, and I'm so glad that you brought up the Egyptian Museum, because I just came from Egypt, and to see the reverence that they have for their culture, it took me years to get to Berlin to see this bust of Nefertiti because it had been stolen. So can you tell me, what do the economics of the U.S. and other European countries have to do with the collection and the looting of art, and they only take things that have no signature on them? They only take things that are cannot be identified to a certain person. They're not stealing any Picassos because they know Picasso made those. So how does the economics play into it?
And then right across the aisle, Pam.
Hello, all. Good evening. My name is Shamika. I'm an artist. I also work for a nonprofit that connects art and health initiatives. My question for the panel is, could you speak to the responsibility of the current holding institutions to create or support the creation of structure and institution in cases where the source community doesn't have it?
And then last question, the gentleman in the back.
You're keeping track of this.
Yeah, I know.
This is a primer for the reception afterwards. So
one of the challenges that some museums face is that donors are overly generous because of tax write-off reasons. I wonder how museums cope with that without offending the donors, that maybe they're ancient artifacts or modern works of art. In the case of the Asian Museum, when it used to be known as the Freer-Sackler Museum, and in a sense, are the Sackler donated art or money tainted because of that, opioid connection or whatever?
So we have about 3 minutes left in this panel. So with that, I will allow our panelists to conclude by having the input of these great questions. But of course, people will stick around afterwards to have follow-up conversations. Yeah.
Oh, well, I want to get to the members of the panel who I think probably have more direct access to many of the answers here. But the one thing that I would offer in response to your question is that some of it can begin by information gathering and building a historical record, oral histories that are then taken down and memorialized, and going from there. Turn to you.
Well, first, I think it's an excellent question. And maybe some of the answers may be found through research, but you don't know what's been lost if you haven't been exposed to it. And you have to really rely on cultural memory, maybe stories that have been passed down through generations. Also, what might be helpful is, talking to others, maybe if your parents have had access to, the elders in the community. You're trying to piece the history of your community back together, because those objects hold power, they hold memory, identity, and story within them. And that's one of the reasons why having those cultural objects in those communities and having the people of those communities create those objects, because you understand the cultural nuances that lie within. So we're not talking about just replicating a piece for the sake of replicating it. It has to have a level of cultural meaning and authenticity within it. So, I hope that you go the route of trying to piece all of this together, because it would be of such great service to you as you're putting your internal self and history back together, and certainly for your family and the Nigerian community at large. I represent several Nigerian artists and who are deeply connected to their roots. So it's just such a profound question, and one that, needs to really be contemplated seriously, and one that I hope you will lead the effort, at least, if nothing for no one else, but for yourself and your family.
Mr. Director, the last word is with you.
So
professionals draw a distinction between tangible and intangible cultural heritage. Of course, they overlap. And an example of really important intangible cultural heritage is memory. So my bit of advice would be document that oral history. In fact, we have a project right now. We're documenting the oral history of a former director of the National Museum in Kabul, because in his head there sits an enormous deposit of cultural heritage, which is what happened during the Soviet occupation, what happened after the Soviet occupation, what happened after America's intervention. On this the best questions elicit complex and sometimes prolix answers. I will try to avoid the prolix. Museums, I'll be provocative, perhaps. I have the floor at the end. Are very good at mystifying their practices. And one of the ways in which museums have mystified their practices is by representing themselves as apart from the market, involved in a scientific project which is collecting specimens, exercising connoisseurship and taste. In fact, museums are part of a market which is driven by transactions and profits and a continuous chain of exchange. You cannot understand the history of our museum, the British Museum, aka the British Museum, and the book was written about it. The history of that museum cannot be disentangled from British colonialism. The history of our museum can be disentangled almost entirely from the history of colonialism, almost entirely. It cannot be disentangled. In fact, its origin story is impossible to understand without appreciating the coercive power of capital and the rise of global capitalism and industrial capitalism. So, again, your question is a very trenchant one, which leads in multiple directions. And one of the ways in which we're trying to, again, be transparent is to describe how our collection came together. If you visit Gallery 9 in the Freer, what you'll find is an increasingly, I'd like to think, sophisticated account of our founding father, which makes clear that moment within 8 years of America's imperial origins, 1898, and the role of industrial capitalism in the assembly of our founding collection.
This has been an incredibly rich discussion. I could not be more grateful for our hosts at the Aspen Institute, our sponsors that brought us all together, you all for being here and taking up your evening, but most of all for an incredible panel that decided to not spend time with their jobs and their families, but rather share their insights here with us. So please join me in thanking a phenomenal panel.